meest betrouwbare boek dat bestaat. Daar kan ik ook uren over vertellen, want er bestaan geen manuscripten die zo betrouwbaar zijn dan de Bijbel door de eeuwen heen, dus ook tot op vandaag aan de dag. En daarom hebben we ook deze site, www.woonbijbel.nl. En al die programma's zenden we ook uit op Brinktv.com. U kunt ze elk moment kunt u ze zien. Dus als u deze gezien hebt en de vorige niet, dan kijkt u even op Brinktv.com. Kunt u ze allemaal weer zien. En woonbijbel.nl wil dus zeggen dat ga nou toch eens een keer in die Bijbel wonen. Want ik blijf zeggen, je leest de Bijbel niet, maar de Bijbel leest jou. Als de Bijbel, en heel veel mensen twijfelen daaraan natuurlijk, maar als de Bijbel het woord van God is, de openbaring van God, dan leest die Bijbel jou. En als die Bijbel jou leest, moet je heel voorzichtig zijn, want dan zijn er miljoenen mensen door de eeuwen heen die hebben dat woord in hun hart laten zakken en zijn, noemen ze dat, tot geloof gekomen, maar hebben een geweldige kijk gekregen op het leven wat ze nu leven en ook het eeuwige leven. Nou, wie zou dat nog willen missen? Maar luister maar niet meer naar mij, ga nu het programma maar kijken en ik ben ervan overtuigd dat je ervan zult genieten.
Hi, we are back, another week, another program on archaeology and the Bible. Hope you've enjoyed the series so far. We will continue our discussion with Jay Smith on how archaeology confirms the Bible. Join us on this program. I want to change gear now a little bit. We've been talking about biblical manuscripts and the evidence for the manuscripts for the New Testament throughout the centuries, various translations, languages, geographical locations. And you mentioned, in fact, that we can be assured of 99.99% of the authenticity of the Greek text we have in our hands today.
Yeah.
I actually heard an Islamic scholar some years ago at the University of Georgia who made the comment that he had a glass of water and he said, you Christians and your scholars say that 99.99% of the New Testament has been preserved for us, but if there's 1/10 of 1% impurity in this water, it makes the whole glass of water impure and useless. But on the other hand, the Koran is 100% pure. The Koran has been preserved without any problems, any imperfections. And this, of course, I want to be very clear that I do not want to be disrespectful of the faith of our Muslim friends. This is not about bashing somebody's religion, but we're talking about manuscript evidences. We're talking about the manuscript evidence for the Bible versus the manuscript evidence for the scriptures of Islam.
Yeah.
We're talking about historical objects and artifacts that anybody can go, examine, study, and interpret.
Yeah.
This is not about, it's not a faith issue. It's very much a historical, scientific issue that we can look at and decide what kind of evidences exist for a particular scripture and the manuscript evidence for that. So, what would you say?
We're going to have to do a number of things here. In order to answer that question, I think we need to go back to the British Museum and take a look at the coins. But before we go back and look at those coins, let's understand why they're important. If you're going to talk about a script, scripts change. Every script changes. Let's use the example of English. If you were to go back 100 years ago and look at some books or writings here in London, you would notice that the letter S is actually an F shape. Today, we don't use F for S. We now use the little squiggly line for S. This is quite normal. Letters change, and we know when they change. Handwritings change, scripts change. We know that there are all kinds of scripts in the English language. This case is very much the same in the Quranic script or Arabic script, and there's Arabic script which came out of the Nabatean script, which came out of the Aramaic script. So it's actually a very new script. Muslims like to say that Arabic is God's language and has always existed. There's no documentation before the 4th century BC for anything Arabic. So it's a very new language.
4th century BC?
It's 4th century BC. There's no reference, and you can see that it's come out of these other certainly Middle Eastern scripts that are much older, such as the Aramaic, such as the cuneiform that we saw in the British Museum. That was the ancient script, even that the Hebrews used. But when you come to the Arabic script itself, there have been many studies done by Europeans, people like Dr. Gerhard Quinn, Dr. von Bothmer, Dr. Odlig, they're in Germany, probably are some of the greatest scholars on the ancient archaic Arabic script. They live in Western Germany. They teach at Saarland University in Saarbrücken. And it's they who are the ones that are starting to show us how the Arabic scripts have changed. When you look at the Arabic script, you will see that it changes by geographical location. It also changes by dynastic influence. Dynasties want their own script to be able to show who they are. And this is very evident when you look at the manuscripts. Now, the problem is we don't have very many early manuscripts. We need to go to inscriptions on rocks. We need to go to inscriptions on pottery. We need to go to inscriptions on coins. Those are the best way to see how the Arabic script changes. Now, what I want to do now is let's go to the coins itself. Now, I want to go back to the British Museum now, and I want to go to the numismatic room, because there you will see a great example of how the Arabic script changes. Let's go there now and let's take a look at the coins and see how the script changes. And then we'll come back and discuss what the impact of that is, or the importance of what they're to tell us. Now, to answer that question, we need to come back to the coins again. Because when you come down this panel here to number 16 to 18, we will see where this man, Abdul al-Malik, starts introducing the Arabic script, takes off the icons and puts Arabic script. He is known as the great Arab reformer, and that's one of the things he is credited with. But take a look at the script that's there. That is not the script that you see on the Topkapi. That is not the script that you see in the Samarkand. It is the Hijazi script. It's a much more perpendicular script. The majuscules are straight up and down. Sometimes they're slanted a little bit, like we saw up there with the Maitel manuscript. Well, what is interesting is when you come to the next line below, number 20 to 22, it is here that you see that elongated script introduced. Those are the Abbasid coins. They did not like the Umayyads. They hated the Umayyads, who controlled Islam from the mid-7th century up until the mid-8th century. From around 660 up to 749, the Umayyads controlled Islam. They had taken the capital and put it up in Damascus. The Abbasids hated them. Once they attained and took power, they then took the capital from Damascus and brought it down to Baghdad. And the Abbasids wanted to basically show that they were now in power. They didn't have radio, television, they didn't have newspapers like we do today to do that. So what do they use? They use the coins. And that's why the coins are so important. And it's the Abbasids then who are responsible for much of the theology. It's the Abbasids who are responsible for the whole image of the Prophet himself. It's the Abbasids who are responsible for a good bit of all the material that we have to go to. Certainly the manuscripts that you see, the elongated text, which they introduced at that time. Most all the manuscripts that we have, the archaic ones, have that elongation, which proves that they have all come out of the Abbasid era. The Abbasids were the Arabs living there in Basra, Baghdad, who then eradicated much of the Sassan influence. They were the ones that imposed their own influence on it. And of course today the Persians don't like that. And of course they would like to get back to the pre-Abbasid period, to get back to their own identity. So to summarize what we've just seen there in the British Museum, basically what that tells us is that certainly the Samarkand and the Topkapi, the two manuscripts that Muslims claim are Uthmanic, are not Uthmanic at all. They are actually 9th century manuscripts, not 7th century manuscripts. So we're missing that 200-year gap. What are we going to do? We've got to find some manuscripts that's early enough to help the Muslims with their claim. Well, there are other manuscripts. In fact, there's one right here in London. Let's go to it now. I want to show you probably the second oldest manuscript that has been claimed today, and it's in the possession of the British Library. It's in the Riblack Gallery. It's called the 2165 manuscript, or the Ma'il manuscript. And we'll go there. Let's go look at it, and then let's come back and come to some conclusions. When you look at this manuscript, you will notice that it has a particular style of script, what we call the Hijazi script, which was very popular in the Hijaz part of Arabia, that central part of Arabia, where Medina and Mecca are. It is also a slanted script. You will see the letters are at a right angle. This is the word that is used for this is ma'il. What you'll also notice that there are no diacritical marks. There are no dots above and below the line, nor are there any vowelization, proving that it's an archaic text. When we come over to this manuscript over here, a 9th century manuscript, you'll see that the script has changed. Now we come into a much more elongated script. You'll see there's elongation between the majuscules, between the consonants. You'll notice that there are some diacritical marks, the red marks, if you see closely, above and below the line. They're just being imposed, but they've been imposed at a later date. You will also notice that there are no vowelizations in this text as well. This is what we call the Kufic text, or the Abbasid text, as we're calling it now. This is a later text. Let's come back to this Quran over here. This has been dated to the late 8th century. It is not complete. It only goes up to around Surah 41. Much of the Quran is missing in this. The difficulty is we're now trying to not only date these, we're also trying to see what, if there are any manuscript variants in these manuscripts. This is still a brand new research that's being done, and we, of course, are going to find an awful lot of new information that we now need to go public. We'll talk more about that later. But it is important that you can see both of these manuscripts, the Ma'il and the Kufic, do not have this diacritical marks or the vowelization, which Muslims believe should give it that archaic look. We'll talk about that significance later on. Right. The Ma'il, the 2165 manuscript. It's obvious that this is the script, that slanted script, is older than the Kufic, Eastern Kufic, or the Abbasid script. What's interesting is you also have dating that by looking at the medallions. Medallions delineate every verse. Usually a round medallion like you see in the Topkapi manuscript, or sometimes there are two dots with another dot above it like you see in the Kufic text that you see there, that we have there in the British Library. On the Kufic text, it was obvious that those had been imposed in. There's no space for them. They'd just been slapped in between two words, much imposed in a much later date. With the Topkapi, Muslims are trying to tell me that these medallions were added much later. That's why it's obvious that this is a much earlier text, because the medallions were only incorporated, the versification was only incorporated in the late 8th century. The fact that they're in the Topkapi seems to suggest that this is a much later manuscript. Muslims say no, the medallions are added much later, but there's a gap to accommodate it. So Muslims are trying to tell me that this was written in the 7th century, leaving the gap there with the intention of putting the medallions in 100 years later. The fact they knew where the gap was, the fact they knew where the verses were, proved that versification existed. Obviously, this manuscript could have only been a late 8th century. What scholars are saying today, Dr. Safadi, Dr. Martin Lings, have come to the conclusion that both the Samarkand and the Topkapi are not 7th century manuscripts. At the earliest, they are probably either late 8th century or early 9th century. Around 820 is the date they're giving. Both Safadi and Martin Lings are Muslims. Dr. Martin Lings was the curator for the British Library. He was responsible for all the manuscripts there, including the Sinaiticus and the Alexandrinus. And they have come to that conclusion. If they've come to that conclusion, I think we should come to the same conclusion. If we look at how this script is changing, this is the question we're looking at. If we see how the script is changing, then you would expect that Hijazi script that we see there in the Ma'il, in the 2165 manuscript, would be the earlier one. It's dated to the late 8th century. We're still missing something. We want something earlier than that, because late 8th century, 780, 790, is still much too late. If Muhammad died in 632, and the Uthmanic manuscript that Bukhari talks about and the Muslims claim as the Uthmanic recension that they all use today, 650, mid-7th century, where is that intermediary, where are those manuscripts from that intermediary period? Well, let me just give you one other manuscript that has been discovered. In 1975, in Yemen, the capital of Yemen, the city of Sana'a, they were cleaning out the dome of the mosque, the Sana'a mosque, and they came to a trapdoor. And when they opened up the trapdoor, thousands of manuscripts fell to the ground. Now, this is not unusual. Whenever manuscripts become old, whenever they become crinkled, whenever they wear out, you don't burn them, you don't destroy them, you hide them away, you put them away in mosque domes, quite normal, and you leave them there, many times forgotten. In this case, quite forgotten. Everybody forgot that those manuscripts were there. As they started piecing through these different manuscripts, they came across one manuscript that troubled them because they could not read it. It didn't have any diacritical marks. It didn't have any vowelization. The dots are above and below the line, so you can know how to translate the consonantal text You know, in Arabic, you have 3 letters, 3 consonants for every word, and from those 3 consonants in the third person singular, you then add suffixes and prefixes to then try to get your grammatization. And you need to know what those 3 letters are to know how to then to add and delete the suffixes and prefixes, and that's why you have the dots above and below the line. And we locked the U shape, just the U shape itself could be 5 different letters. If you put a dot above it, it's a nun. If you put 2 dots above it, it's a ta. If you put 3 dots above it, it's a tha. If you put a dot below it, it's a ba. If you put 2 dots below it, it's a ya. So, na, ta, tha, ba, ya. Which one is it? Well, you need the dots. Those were only added in the early 8th century. So you can pretty well know that any ancient manuscript that does not have those dots is an archaic form. The vowelization was added even later because for dialectic differences, you have many different dialects of Arabic. Those dialects start forming when the Arabs moved into other areas, into your area. When they came into Baghdad and Iran, Baghdad and Basra, moving as far over as what is today Tehran. The cities they were originally called like Ctesiphon. When they came into the Pahlavi language, as the Pahlavi encroached upon the Arabic, an amalgamation was formed, a new dialect was formed. The same thing as they moved up north and they moved into Damascus, they came across the Greek text. In the Greek language, a dialect was formed. And this is what happens with dialect. But they form over a period of 100 to 200 years. When these dialects form, you need something to show which dialect you're using when you read a consonantal text. And that's where vowelization was introduced. The dama, the kasra, the fatha. So these were probably introduced in the late 8th century. You can see when we looked at the Koran, the 2165, they didn't have any direct marks, nor did they have any vowelization. You wouldn't expect it for something that early. This manuscript that was found in Hizar didn't have any diacritical marks or vowelization. It could not be read because it was so archaic, and it also had a script that was different. They flew down 2 experts in the Arabic script, Dr. Gerdquin and Dr. van Bothma, and Dr. Oleg as well. 3 of them were flown down in 1981 to take a look at this one manuscript, and immediately they took pictures of it, and they put it onto microfilm. Now the Yemeni government confiscated those microfilms, didn't let them have access to them, and they had to go back up to Germany empty-handed. It wasn't until 1997 that finally the Yemeni government permitted the German scholars to have their own microfilms. So from 1997, they've been looking at this manuscript. They put it into a facsimile. I went to see them in 1999 to take a look at this manuscript in Germany, and I've got pictures. We'll show you these pictures of what they say. If you look at those 2 pictures there, you will see that the script is quite unique. In fact, if you look at this one picture, you will see Surah 19 comes halfway down the page. There's that yellow mark there, and Surah 22 starts below it. Halfway down the page at that yellow mark, what happened to Surah 20 and 21? It's missing.
2 surahs are missing from that Quran.
From that page. If you look on the left side of the page, you will notice Surah 20 begins at the top of the page. But it's a totally different script than what's on the right side of the page. On the right side of the page, where 20 and 22 are, is the old Hijazi script. On the left side of the page is the beginning of Surah 20 in a much different script, a much later script, an Abbasid script. Now, there are many schools with the Abbasid script. There are schools within the Hijazi script. Dr. François Droche, the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, he is the one that is basically giving us a chronology of the Arabic script, and he's the one that's standardizing the chronology of the Arabic script. And he's found about 3 or 4 different schools in the Hijazi script and about a good 5 or 6 schools in the Abbasid script. You're looking at different schools of script here within the same manuscript on 2 different pages. Basically, if you look at the right-hand side, compare it with the left-hand side, there's about 100 to 150 years difference between these 2 scripts in the same manuscript. What does that tell you?
Somebody else has been adding
much later.
Much later.
You see an evolution in the script right here within these 2 pages. Now, if this yellow mark, which delineates the break between the 2 surahs, was at the bottom of the page, you could say maybe a goat ate it or it got lost. The fact that it's halfway down the page proves that this surah on the left was never there at the very beginning. This was added at a much later date in that manuscript at the wrong place. And this happens right through. Now, they have not published this yet. I have to be careful because until they publish what they found next, I can't tell you what they have found next. What they have told me about the manuscript variants, enormous number of manuscript variants they found in this manuscript.
So then, just to be clear, what you're saying is that as we look at some very old manuscripts of the Quran in Arabic, that there are differences in various manuscripts?
Absolutely. On the right side, which is the Hijazi text, that has been dated to 705. That's early 8th century. It's roughly about 65 years after the Quranic. The Uthmanic text should have been written. So this is by far the earliest portion of the Quranic text that we have in our possession today. On the left side is a much later date, because it's using a script that was only introduced after the Abbasid period. The Abbasids came to power in 749, as we saw with the coins. The coins prove that. And there's that elongated, much more illustrative, much more flowery text that was introduced halfway through the 8th century. So here you see difference in the script. But what's even more interesting is the manuscript variants. Words, phrases that are found in this manuscript that are not found in the manuscript we have today. Now, Muslims have not admitted this. There has not been a study on the Yemeni or the Sana manuscript. Why not? To this date, there has not been one published study on this manuscript, yet it's proven to be the oldest manuscript in existence. The Yemeni government will not allow people to look at this manuscript. It has not been sent around the world like you would think it would be. They could be making a mint off this manuscript. Museums, scholars all over the world would love to get a hold of this manuscript. Why is it they don't allow people to look at it? Why is it they don't publish it? Why is it they haven't put a museum to basically just for this manuscript, if it's the oldest manuscript in existence?
I was reminded that the different attitude of biblical scholars. As soon as we find something, we want to investigate it, research it, bring it forth to the public. But it seems like many Muslim authorities don't like to reveal these differences.
Let me just give you an example of the Sinaiticus that we saw earlier. The Sinaiticus, if you were to go a year ago or even 2 years ago down to the Riblack Gallery, the authorities there in the Riblack Gallery, in the British Library, had it open to Mark chapter 16. And showing the whole world that verses 9 to 20 are not found in this manuscript. It's a polemic against the biblical text. We didn't bother about it. It didn't bother any of us. It was quite interesting that they did it. In fact, I loved it because I could bring my students to show that the earliest manuscript don't have these earliest verses. So it's certainly not a problem for the biblical manuscripts, and certainly for the biblical scholars or even the British Library, to show when there are inadequacies in a text. Why is it that the Muslim authorities there in Yemen do not allow us not even to go and see it, but don't even mention that it exists, let alone give a publication of what they found?
They are concerned.
There is a concern here. Now, when the Muslims claim that the Quran can be traced back to its origin, what manuscript are they using? When did their canon come in? When does the canon of the Arabic text come to be? Do you know the date for it?
No, I don't.
1924. It was not till 1924 that the canonized text that we use today was actually created. And it was done at Al-Azhar University in Egypt. That's less than 100 years ago. So when they talk about a canonized text for the Quran, what manuscript are they referring to? They cannot be referring to this Yemeni text. They cannot even be referring to the Samarkand. The Samarkand only goes up to Surah 41. They better not refer to the Ma'il text, the one manuscript we saw in the British Library. That only goes up to Surah 43. There's 114 surahs. What manuscript are they referring to? To this date, they won't tell us what manuscript they are. They are, as a biblical scholar, as somebody who looks at the Bible and asks the same question, I would never, ever make the claim like that unless I could support it with the manuscript evidence. That's why the Sinaiticus, the Alexandrinus are there for anybody to look at. We can go with our not with your cameras. You can't just go and take pictures of it. You have to get permission for that. But anybody can look at those manuscripts. So there are tens and tens of doctorates been done on the Sinaiticus alone. You can go and see the entire manuscript, the whole facsimile of the Sinaiticus, up online. Nobody hides away our manuscripts. We leave them for everybody to look at. Nobody censors the criticism of those manuscripts. We even admit it in our own Bibles. We put a line before and after to show what verses are not found in the earliest manuscripts. We are very honest about it. Muslims need to do the same. And until they do the same, the claims they make we're not going to listen to. They have to persuade me. They have to persuade you that these manuscripts can be traced back 1,400 years. As it stands today, the only thing they can legitimately say is that the manuscript evidence for the Quran only goes back 1,200 years, not 1,400 years.
So there is a 200-year gap.
Roughly 150 to 200-year gap
between the beginning of the Islamic
for a complete
expansion.
Quranic manuscript. So there are facsimiles, and you might say, goodness sakes, much of the Quran, a good bit of it, has been borrowed from other sources. So certainly you can go back to sectarian writings, apocryphal writings that we talked about. Certainly you can go back to Christian sectarian writings to put together roughly from 50 to 70% of the Quran can be found from earlier texts. all of them apocryphal, none of them considered to be authoritative by the Jews and the Christians because of the borrowings. No one's disputing that. Well, they should dispute that because those are available. What we're saying is the Quran as we have it today, the 114 surahs, in the versification order that we see today, cannot be traced back to the 7th century, cannot be traced back to the 8th century. It's only beginning of the late part of the 8th century to the beginning of the 9th century that we finally find a complete manuscript. And even those, we would love to be able to investigate. We would love to be able to do some forensic evidence on them, not only to date them, but to see what they include.
I want a clarification question about the manuscript variances in Arabic text of the Quran. Are there also variances between the Topkapi text and the Samarkand text?
Well, this is something we'd love to be able to talk about. I can't answer that question because nobody is permitted to look at the Topkapi. The
Muslims
Samarkand,
have not made it open.
it's
for
not available.
investigation.
The Samarkand is. The Samarkand for the first time has been made available because Princeton University has been able to get a facsimile. In fact, I've got a copy of it on my computer. For the first time, we're looking at the Samarkand, which is a 9th century manuscript, not a 7th century. It's 820, 9th century, so 820 AD. Muhammad died in 630, about 200 years after Muhammad's death. That one only goes up to Surah 41.
The date you said for that manuscript is a very established date by scholars.
Oh, Muslims will not admit to it at all. I've never heard a Muslim that would like to admit to it. But
Yeah.
no Muslim I've talked to has ever been able to support their dating. No, these are by Western scholars.
Western scholars,
Who have looked at it, looked at the script analysis like we've done earlier, compared it with other manuscripts, compared it with other coins, who have done what we call forensic evidence on it. Now, they can't touch it. It would be great if the Muslims would allow us to be able to do some accelerated mass spectrography, AMS, which actually can date it, can actually use forensic evidence to date it within 20 years. We've done that with the Sinaiticus, and all the biblical manuscripts have been open to AMS and other forms of forensic evidence. The Quranic manuscripts, they won't let us touch it.
So just a simple conclusion to a lot of this discussion is that the manuscripts for the New Testament vastly outnumber the manuscript for the Arabic text of the Quran.
Absolutely, and that's curious.
Yeah.
Because the Arabic Qurans are written much later. We're not talking about the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th century. We're talking 7th, 8th, and 9th, and 10th century. When at a time when there was vellum, when there was parchment, there was no problem getting material that would have been able to last for 1400 years.
A lot of people were writing things.
Absolutely. From the 4th century on, there was a proliferation in codices, in books, because of the fact of the durability of the material that was used, the parchment and the vellum, the animal skins. By the 8th century, paper was brought in from China. Paper was quite popular at that time. There's no reason in the world for the Muslims not to have these earliest manuscripts, especially when they tell us that these were written by Zayd ibn Thabit, Ubay ibn Ka'b, Ibn Mas'ud, Ibn Musa. Those are 4 of the compilers of the Quran, 4 different manuscripts from 4 different cities. We call them the Metropolitan Codices. Zayd ibn Thabit, whose codex became popular in Medina. Ubay ibn Ka'b, whose codex became popular in Damascus. Ibn Mas'ud, whose codex became very popular in what is today Baghdad. And Ibn Musa, whose codex became very popular in Basra. 4 different cities, 4 different codices, all of which are referred to by Al-Bukhari, also in Sahih Muslim. And when you look and see what we find out about those 4 different codices, there's about 15,000 differences between those 4 codices. From the traditions themselves. The traditions themselves tell us about these differences. Now, let me just tell you what the traditions say, because I want to be careful that I don't just say these things off the top of my head. Let me give you some references to the traditions concerning these codices.
Traditions written by Muslim authorities.
These are all Muslim, and I'm going to give you the name of the Muslim authorities so that we can corroborate it. Because I want to make sure that people who are listening to this don't just listen to me. I could be making this off the top of my head. I want to make sure that I house it in their own traditions. Listen to what they say. This is Ibn Abi Dawud, who is one of the 6 most authoritative compilers of the Hadith.
In Sunni Islam.
Sunni Islam, and he is authoritative, second only to Bukhari and Sahih Muslim. He says this: many of the passages of the Quran that were sent down were known by those who died at the day of Yamama in 633. The battle of Yamama that happened after Muhammad died. But they were not known by those who survived them, nor were they written down. Nor had Abu Bakr, Umar, or Uthman, the 3 first caliphs, collected the Quran, nor were they found with even one person after them. Saying basically that much of the Quranic verses were lost. Listen to what As-Suyuti says. As-Suyuti. He says, It is reported from Ismail ibn Ibrahim, from Ayub, from Nafi, from Ibn Umar. This is the isnad that's there at the beginning of the text. Let none of you say, I have acquired the whole of the Quran. How does he know what all of it is, when much of the Quran has disappeared? Rather let him say, I have acquired what has survived.
Wow.
What an admission.
Tell me about
Let's continue.
this admission. Who made this admission?
This is As-Suyuti.
What's his significance?
As-Suyuti is probably one of the greatest respected tafsir writers. He's writing in 911 AH, which is around 1600. And every Muslim should know As-Suyuti. He is so well known, so popular for his tafsir. Now let's go on to Sahih Muslim. Well, now we're going into the 9th century, much earlier. Sahih Muslim is second only to Al-Bukhari in importance. Look what he says. We used to recite a surah which resembled in length the severity called Barat. I have, however, forgotten it, with the exception of this, which I remember of it, and then he preached. This is referring to a Quranic reference that has been forgotten. Or let's go to Al-Bukhari himself. Nobody, if you're a Sunni, you do not doubt Al-Bukhari. He is Sahih. That means he is perfect. There is no error in what he says. And this is what he quotes. And this is found in volume 5, hadith number 416. We used to read a verse of the Quran revealed in their connection, but later the verse was cancelled. And it was conveyed to our people on behalf of the information that we have met our Lord and he is pleased with us and has made us pleased. This is Al-Bukhari writing this. Let's go to something else Al-Bukhari says. This is the verse on Rajab. Rajab is a very contentious verse. Listen what Al-Bukhari says about this. Allah sent Muhammad, and this is, in volume 8 of Al-Bukhari, hadith number 817. Allah sent Muhammad with the truth and revealed the holy book to him. And among what Allah revealed was the verse of Rajab, the stoning of married persons, male and female, who commit adultery. And we did recite this verse and understood and memorized it. Allah's apostle did carry out the punishment of stoning, and so did we after him. I'm afraid that after a long time has passed, somebody will say, by Allah, we do not find the verse of Rajam in Allah's book, and thus they will go astray by leaving the obligation which Allah has revealed. What an admission. This is Umar, the second case, is saying this. The verse on Rajam was there in the Quran. The Prophet stoned, we stoned. Now when you look in the Quran, if you look in Surah 24, it's 100 lashes. They've changed,
The
taken
punishment
out.
for adultery is
It's
not
100
stoning
lashes.
from
It's
the
no longer
Quran.
stoning. But it was there originally in the Quran. Even he's admitting that there's a problem here. How can you change the word of God because you don't like the punishment? That's Al-Bukhari saying this. Let's continue on. Ibn Dawud, look what he says. Khuzaimah ibn Thabit said, I see you have overlooked 2 verses and have not written them. They said, and which are they? And he replied, I had it directly, automatically, spontaneous from the messenger of Allah. There has come to you a messenger from yourself. It grieves him that you should perish. He is very concerned about you. To the believers, he is kind and merciful. That we find in Surah 9, Ayah 128. To the end of the surah, Uthman said, I bear witness that these verses are from Allah. Here it takes someone like Uthman to bear witness of a verse that somehow had been overlooked. Let's continue on. Ibn Malik says this. Abu Yunus, freedman of Aisha, mother of believers, reported Aisha, the favored wife of Muhammad, saying this, ordered me to transcribe the Holy Quran and asked me to let her know when I should arrive at the verse, Habtul ala salati wa salati wastu wa kumu lillala. Now, I have to be careful. My pronunciation is very American. When I arrived at the verse, I informed her, and she ordered, write it this way. Aisha is telling her that to write it this way, not that way, but to write it this way. And then she rewrites how she wants it written. She added that she had heard it from the Apostle of Allah that way. That we find in Muwatta Ibn Malik. And let me end with this one. This is from Ibn Abi Dawud. Again, one of the 6 most authoritative transcribers of the Hadith. Altogether, Al-Hajjaj ibn Hajjaj ibn Yusuf was the governor of Kufa at the time of Ibn al-Malik, which is around 685 to 705. So late 7th century, you have the governor of Kufa. That's a good 50 to 60 years after Muhammad's death. He says this. Altogether, Al-Hajjaj ibn Yusuf made 11 modifications in the reading of the Uthmanic text. And then it gives the reference. He made a modification in Surah 2, Ayah 259. He made a modification in Surah 5, Ayah 48. And it goes on and on. All the different 11 modifications. As late as the 7th century, they were still modifying it according to the Islamic traditions. Now stop and think what I have just said. We have here Ibn Malik talking about how some of the Quranic verses have been lost. You have As-Suyuti talking about how some of the Quranic verses have disappeared. You have Sahih Muslim saying how some of them have been forgotten. You have Al-Bukhari saying how some of the verses have been cancelled. He goes on to say how some have been missing. Ibn Abi Dawud saying that some of the Quranic verses have been overlooked. Imam Malik talking about how some of the Quranic verses have been changed, and here you have Ibn Dawud saying that a good bit of the Quranic verses have been modified. Is this perfect?
That doesn't sound like 100% purity to me.
Absolutely. And this is all coming out of the Islamic traditions. None of this is coming from Christian sources, secular sources. It's coming from the Muslim sources themselves.
And these are not critics of Islam who are making these claims. These are, in fact, the founders of the Islamic traditions and Islamic law and Islamic commentary who are admitting these things.
No one questions Al-Bukhari. No one questions Ibn Dawud. No one questions Sahih Muslim. And certainly no one questions As-Suyuti. Can you imagine now how disturbing this would be? Now, what it tells me is that certainly in the 9th, 10th, 11th century, the Muslims there had no problem, had no doubt that the Quran had been modified, changed, had been overlooked. This claim that the Quran has never been changed is a 21st century apologetic. This is not what the 9th century Muslims claimed. This is a much more recent apologetic. And the reason I think it's come out so recently is because of whatever they're finding out about the Bible. The Bible is proving to be so authoritative. We don't have anybody making these kind of claims. You will not find Christians talking about being lost, disappeared. Certainly not in the early church. You will find certainly sectarian writings. But these are not sectarian authors. And because of the fact that we're, as you've seen with the biblical text, with the New Testament text, because our New Testament is so authoritative, you can then understand why Muslims today want the same type of authority. They're making the claim that it has never been changed. But have you noticed, when Ahmed Didat, and he does it often on debates, he never supports it with any scripture. He never supports it with any traditions. He never supports it with any reference. He makes the claim without ever supporting it. I would never do that if I was going to be a Christian or a Muslim. I don't have to worry about that with the New Testament. There is case after case after case of corroboration. But then the Muslims, if they're going to make this claim, they've got to go and answer us, why is it that the early Muslim writers, the compilers of the Hadith, the compilers of the Sirah, the compilers of the Tafsir, the compilers of the Tahqiq, why is it that they had assumed that the Quran had been changed, overlooked, forgotten, cancelled?
Jay, you've been enlightening, you've been encouraging, edifying, and again, I want to thank you for what you have taught us today. Thank you for watching our program today. We'll see you next time.